Welcome to Matt and the Macabre, a podcast about all things horror. Join us each week as we review another film, video game, story, or novel in the horror genre. Be warned, there will be major spoilers and harsh language. Listener discretion is advised.
What's up, guys? Hello, and welcome back to Matt and the Macabre. Thank you so much for checking out the show. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm Matt. I'll be your host. And before we get started, I do want to take just a quick moment to plug our Patreon that's getting up and going. Head over to patreon.com/mattandthemacabre. There's exclusive content like uncut episodes. You can hear me stutter and trip over my own tongue and just generally struggle to word good. And there'll also be some exclusive stuff that will never be released on the main feed, looking into some behind-the-scenes stuff, some video streams, stuff like that coming down the pipeline. So definitely head over and check that out if you're enjoying the show. And now, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into Friday the 13th, Part 2. Released just shy of a year after the original due to its wild success that nobody saw coming. The budget on this one was a little bit bigger. It was $1.25 million, but the box office was not quite as big, did just under $22 million. This one was directed by Steve Miner, who was the assistant director on the original. He would go on to direct Part 3 and then a smattering of other films, including House, Halloween H2O, which I think is actually a fairly solid entry in the Halloween series, Lake Placid, Big Bully, and the 2008 remake of Day of the Dead. But with the possible exception of H2O, I think it's safe to say he never gets any better than what we see in this film. With the major success that the first movie had, they knew they were going to do a sequel. However, the original plan was basically every year just to use and keep the Friday the 13th name, and it would be like an anthology series. Every year there'd be a new movie revolving around something horror-themed and taking place on Friday the 13th, but there would be no interconnecting story. It was actually Phil Scuderi, and I'm positive I butchered his name, one of the producers, who insisted that they follow up on that jump scare at the ending and have Jason as the killer. Steve Miner agreed and believed in it, and so that's the basic genesis of the movie that we have now, which takes place 5 years after the original. And speaking of the timeline, I do want to take just a quick minute to address the fact that continuity is a dirty word in Friday the 13th. If you are looking for consistency, especially like chronologically, like in the timeline, you are going to be pissed off by the time we get to Part 4. Now, I will say that I think Jason's look has a good, consistent evolution from Part 4 to 6 to 7, but it does completely fall apart at 8, and it's pretty much non-existent between 2 and 3. But as far as the timeline of what happens when, and even when the movies take place relative to each other, it's just an absolute fucking train wreck. And I wasn't going to get into it, but let me go ahead and address that real quick too. The original Friday the 13th takes place in 1979. Part 2 takes place on a Friday the 13th 5 years later. But then Part 3 picks up immediately after 2, so it's basically Saturday the 14th. And then Part 4 takes place immediately after 3, which causes a huge issue with a certain character that I have in Part 4, but I'll save that for that podcast. Some of you probably already know where I'm going with that. But then when we get to Part 5, that takes place a mysterious number of years after 4, 6 X amount of years after 5, 7 who knows how long after 6, but Jason's already in the bottom of the lake before our main girl Tina grows up over the course of maybe 10 years. So it's an unbelievable mess. It's an absolute clusterfuck. There are websites out there that have tried to tackle this, and I really commend them for that. But every single timeline they try to put together, you could pick apart using different details presented in the movies. It's just not doable. But let's go ahead. Let me get back on track here and get back to Friday the 13th Part 2, the movie that we're here to talk about today. As I said, this one didn't make as much as the original, and I'm not really sure why. It did have a slightly bigger opening weekend, but it ended up grossing just roughly half of what the original did. I know the critics hated it, but they hated the first one too. In fact, that's actually a big part of why we got this surge in slasher films during the 80s, because the critics were just making them out to be like this horrible, needs to be forbidden thing that you should stay away from. And just like a little kid, if you make a thing forbidden, all that does is make it even more enticing and make the audiences want to consume these movies. But that's a discussion for people much more intelligent than me. Let's just go ahead and get into the plot. As I said, this one takes place 5 years after the original, but not at first. This opening takes place 2 months after the original movie. Paul's going to fill us in on that fact around the campfire a little later on. But it's not really clear where this is. I've seen some people say basically that Alice returned to Crystal Lake to kind of face her fears and deal with the trauma, and Jason kind of like sniffed her out, and that's where this is happening. I've also seen people say that Jason somehow tracked her all the way to California, which she referenced in the first movie. But that would mean that a deformed mountain man, I guess, rode a Greyhound from New Jersey all the way to California and back again. My personal view on it, I actually like the idea that Alice came back to try to deal with the trauma. I think that makes sense. And so, in my mind, that's always kind of been what's happening here. Or, at least why she is close enough wherever she is that Jason can get to her. The filmmakers actually wanted Adrienne King to star in the sequel, but because she had an obsessive fan, well, a stalker is what he was, let's call a spade, she had a stalker come after her in real life after the original, and so she didn't want to do it anymore. She did agree to come back, but she wanted her part to be as small as possible, which is why we get the opening that we do. The movie opens in the rain with a young boy walking down the sidewalk and splashing in water puddles, singing the Itsy Bitsy Spider. We see his feet walking and splashing, and then when his mom calls him in and he steps off screen, another pair of boots steps onto the screen with like a musical sting, but it's real soft, so it's not really a jump scare. And we may not know it yet, but this is Jason. We cut to Alice in her apartment, obviously having a bad dream, definitely having some bad acting, as she groans and moans and is saying no, and then we get copious flashbacks of the original. I always have it in my mind that part 2 begins with like a 15-minute prologue that's just the footage from the end of the original, but it's actually not that bad, not by a long shot. Out of curiosity, I timed it, and it's 4 minutes and 25 seconds. It is footage from the original, and of course, that mostly just serves to catch up the audience that may not have seen it. There's not much to say there. It's just a highlight reel of the ending, with Alice finding a couple of bodies and fighting with Mrs. Voorhees on the beach, and even Jason jumping up out of the lake to pull her in, and her talking with the officer in the hospital. This is when she finally wakes up and just wanders around the apartment a little bit. She gets a brief phone call from her mother, which doesn't really give us much. We don't learn anything from it. Her mom is really giving her a hard time, though. I think her mom needs to stop and remember that her daughter did have to decapitate a person who had killed all of her friends and was trying to kill her too. So, I don't know who lit the fuse on her mom's tampon, but she needs to chill the fuck out. But this scene always reminds me of that part in the original where Alice was walking around the kitchen by herself right before Ralph showed up in the pantry. There's not much going on, it's just a couple of long shots, but it does have a feel similar to the original, which I like. She does get another phone call, but there's nobody on the other end of the line, which I don't know if it was a deliberate nod to When a Stranger Calls or Black Christmas, but that's how it feels. You know, creepy phone calls were a thing in the late 70s, early 80s for whatever reason. I actually think it was mostly a ploy to get people to buy caller ID. Yeah, that's right, kiddos. Once upon a time, the phone would ring, and you wouldn't have the foggiest idea who was on the other end. But I digress. She starts kind of stalking around her apartment real cautious. She's on edge. The music's a little tense, and she notices that the apartment window's open. She grabs an ice pick off the counter to defend herself with and starts creeping real slowly toward the window. The music's lingering, everything's just kind of hanging in the air, and then a fucking cat is very clearly hurled through that window by someone off screen and screeches on its way in. Now, I'm not usually a fan of the random animal jump scare. I think it's cheap. I think it's bullshit. They're usually pointless and they come out of nowhere. But I will say that this one is executed much better than the one in part 7, which is a scene that makes me irrationally fucking furious. But you're going to have to wait a few weeks to hear about that one. Here, I tend to just go with it. We've only spent a couple minutes in this apartment. Sure, maybe Alice has a cat. She definitely reacts to it like it's her cat, or at least one that she knows. You know, it's not like it's the first time she's ever seen it. But when she offers it something to eat, she goes to the fridge and we see the decapitated, partially rotting head of Pamela Voorhees sitting on the shelf in the fridge. And Alice screams, and one hand suddenly wraps around her from behind while the other one shoves that ice pick straight into her temple. And as Alice dies, the tea kettle starts whistling on the stove, but Jason's kind enough to take it off the burner before we go to that weird whiteout transition again, and the title card comes breaking through the glass just like the first one, and the opening credits roll. When the credits are done, we get another whiteout to a really nice Chevy pickup going down the road, but this time the generic banjo music is mercifully absent. This is our introduction to Sandra and her boyfriend Jeff. They pull over at a gas station and run over to use a payphone. Remember those? They call their buddy Ted to come down and meet them, and we get just a real quick shot of Crazy Ralph back once again, just kind of eyeballing them and seeing what they're up to. And it's while they are running to the payphone that I will address a bit of a controversy that I actually wasn't aware of until a few years ago. I knew this movie had a lot of footage cut out to avoid an X rating and that the MPAA was brutal on it, but what I did not know was why we never see Sandra topless. Now, don't get me wrong, okay? I want to be clear. I don't want to sound like some kind of fucked up horn dog. I don't come into these movies just wanting to see every chick in them with her top off. But let's face it, that's part of the formula for a slasher movie, okay? Let's call a spade a spade. This girl has a huge rack on her. She's never wearing a bra throughout this entire movie. Those things just bounce all over the place as they damn well please. She's even in a sex scene later on. So, if you were making a slasher movie, why would you show off the itty bitty titty committee? No hate on Terry whatsoever, okay? I want to be clear. I'm just a regular dude. I like them all. But then you have a girl whose cups runneth over. You have her in a sex scene, but you never actually show her topless. Well, turns out that's because that actress, Marta Kober, was actually only 16 years old at the time of filming. Apparently they filmed the nudity, even full frontal nudity, which, for whatever reason, was kind of a big deal in the 80s. If you're too young, I can't really explain it to you because I don't get it either, but trust me, it was. So all this was actually filmed, but it was taken out of the movie, and it was said to be destroyed until some footage was supposedly found on a VHS tape back in the 2000s that the effects artist had kept for his own portfolio. Yeah, I bet he did. But anyway, so that footage will never see the light of day. And let me be extraordinarily clear, it definitely should not. So back to the movie. I do love that Jeff is writing down directions here. Many moons ago, little ones, there was no such thing as GPS, and this is how we had to get to places we'd never been before. I remember going on road trips as a kid, and we would stop just about every 2 hours or so for Dad to check the map and, line out the route with a pencil. But Crazy Ralph interrupts them, saying, I warned the others, no one believed me, you're all doomed, and just kind of goes about his way. And while I do enjoy seeing Ralph back, I feel like he doesn't have that same gravitas he did in the original. I don't really know what it is, but his words just don't carry the same weight. He doesn't have that same spooky aura. And while this is going on at the phone booth, we see in the background a tow truck back up to Jeff's truck. And the driver gets out, hooks it up, jumps back in his truck, and just starts taking off with it. Jeff and Sandra haul ass chasing after this tow truck driver for a pretty good way down the road before the driver turns the corner and comes to a stop near a cackling ginger. This is Teddy. the guy they were talking to on the phone, so I guess they're at his house because, of course, there were no cell phones then. Teddy plays the role of the irritating yet somehow lovable goofball. He's constantly wisecracking, constantly telling jokes, and even though none of the jokes are really good, for some reason he's always got me smiling. I really don't want to like this dude, but I do. And he will walk back-asswards into movie history later on as the smartest slasher film character in the history of the genre. Completely by accident, but we'll get to that in a little bit. They come up on a huge tree in the road that's clearly been cut down and put there on purpose. Jeff's driving a huge Chevy truck back when trucks were actually trucks. Not to mention there's no reason whatsoever he couldn't just drive around it. But they stop and he and Teddy drag it out of the road so Sandra can walk around and find an old worn out sign that says Camp Crystal Lake. And this is where Teddy will introduce the story of Camp Blood and mentions that it's on the same lake that the camp they're going to is. So, just in case it's not clear, this is the second movie taking place at a camp on Crystal Lake, but it is not Camp Crystal Lake. Sandra tries to ask Teddy about it, but he just brushes it off real quick and moves them right along. And while whole thing is going on, we get a couple quick POV shots of somebody in the woods watching them wearing a blue flannel shirt. Of course, we know it's Jason, but I don't know if we were supposed to know it at that time. We cut to a dude at the camp ringing a bell to bring everybody in. This is Paul, the head counselor, the guy that's leading this training program for the counselors before the camp actually opens up. And here, I actually like this because we get real fast introductions to all of the core characters and just real quick moments that set them all up real nicely. Like, we see Mark coming down the path in his wheelchair, and Vicky comes out of the cabin right behind him and tries to help, which perfectly sets up their relationship for the rest of the movie, because Vicky's going to do everything but drop her panties and fire a starter's pistol to try and get Mark's attention, while Mark is just going to be completely oblivious and insist on doing everything himself. We cut over to Terry and her little dog Muffin, who may or may not survive, depending on what you believe. Terry is walking along the path, and the camera pays special attention to her ass for several seconds, as somebody in the bushes fires at her with a slingshot, and Scott comes out of the bushes and winks while Terry gives him a go-to-hell look before she turns around and smiles to herself before walking off. Scott is going to spend the movie doing this, trying to get into Terry's pants by pranking her, and I get the sense that Terry might be willing to give him a shot, but she also thinks he's kind of a childish prick, so she's like standoffish with him. But now we've been introduced to most of our main players, so we cut back to Paul and his little introduction speech, which is interrupted by a shot of Ralph riding his bike toward the camp and being passed by a red beetle that's backfiring like an old man with the walking farts. This is Jenny, our final girl of this movie. She interrupts Paul's speech with her car making all kinds of racket as she finally pulls in, and Paul kind of storms off and pulls her over into a cabin and starts to bitch her out because everyone else got here hours ago. She's his assistant. She tells him she's got car trouble, and he says, well, you should have called. And I actually like this, and I thought it was pretty clever. She tells Paul that she tried to call, but the phones aren't even on yet. And in these movies, you always have to establish a reason why the kids are isolated, why nobody can get to them for help. The last movie we saw that the phone line was cut, but this time around, they're going to go ahead and just address it now. And I mean, I damn sure don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill here, but I do think it was a clever way to handle it without just putting a neon sign on it. It was pretty well done. So they go back out, and Paul gives his "let's keep our shit together" speech, as Ted calls it. And he's running down general safety stuff about the knives, the arrows, general common sense, things like that. But then he reminds everybody that this is bear country, which will become a point of contention in a couple of movies. So he gives the standard warnings, no food fights, change your clothes because they can hang on to the smell of food. And then he actually warns the women to make sure they keep their punani clean when they're on their menstrual cycle. And then it just cuts to him going over to help Jenny with the car like he didn't just say that shit. As weird and out of left field as that line is, it does have a really fun little payoff a little later on. But this scene right here tells us everything that we need to know about Jenny. Paul mentions that she's majoring in child psychology, and then we get to watch her play him like a fiddle as she gets him to go around to the engine in the back, pretend to fiddle with it because he clearly doesn't know whether to shit or wind his watch back there. And then he just says, "Go ahead, try it." And she fires it right up, shoots black smoke and shit all over his face, and drives off with a shit-eating grin. It's a real fun little moment, and instantly we are on Jenny's side. At least I am. While this is not my favorite film of the series, Jenny is absolutely my favorite final girl of the series. But now things start to get a little more serious. We fade into later that night. Everybody's around the campfire eating s'mores, and it's at this point that it really hits home how many people there are here. There's like a dozen counselors here. They really hit us with like a bait and switch because we probably think at this point all these people are going to be victims, but in about a half hour, half of them are going to go off into town and disappear for the rest of the movie. But this is where Paul says, I don't want to scare anyone, but I'm going to give it to you straight about Jason. And this is where we officially establish Jason as the killer. He goes through this whole spiel about the old timers will tell you that Jason's basically living out on his own, living off animals and vegetation and stealing what he needs to survive. And this is actually a big point of contention within the Friday the 13th fandom. Did Jason drown as a boy in 1957 or not? A lot of people believe that Jason has always been a supernatural killer, which is why he survives parts 2 and 3 and keeps coming back in the sequels. But others, myself included, believe that Jason did not actually drown. This school of thought is basically that Jason survived the drowning, barely, but because he was a special kid and really just mentally not there, which we know because Mrs. Voorhees told us that in the first movie without using those words. She's yelling at Alice and saying Jason needed to be watched every minute. And then she just pauses and then says he wasn't a very good swimmer. That tells us everything that we need to know. But because this kid was so mentally messed up and just not in his right mind, instead of running back to his mom, he ran off in the woods and just grew up surviving on whatever he could to become this weird backwood mountain man. I am in the camp that says Jason didn't become supernatural until part 6 when he was literally brought back from the dead. Before that, he was just a tough dude that was hard to kill. But I do have to say, Paul tells the story masterfully. He's got everybody riveted. He's telling it quietly, drawing them in. He's got everybody looking over their shoulders. He tells everybody that Jason's been dormant for 5 years, but he's out there. He's watching for intruders. And he drops his voice to almost a whisper. And then a deformed man brandishing a spear shrieks into the frame. Everybody screams and hauls ass away from the campfire, except for Paul, who's already laughing because it was actually just Teddy in a rubber mask and a fur loincloth. This is basically his way of getting all the Jason shit out of everybody's system. He doesn't want to hear any more about it, and it's time to move on, but he does give a stern warning that Camp Crystal Lake is off limits. Teddy leans the spear up against the wall in the cabin and sets the mask on top of it, and the way the camera lingers on it is basically slasher movie code for, hey guys, pay attention because this is going to come back up later. And here is where we're supposed to get to know the characters a little more. Mark is arm wrestling with the other male counselors and pretty handily beating them. Scott pops his collar and asks Terry to dance, and when she turns him down, instead he goes to her dog Muffin. I really want to like Scott. I feel like his character was written to be, just that average dude who wants the girl but just tries too hard. But there's just something about the way the actor looks and plays him. He always comes off either creepy or smarmy or both, and it just never really works. Jenny beats Paul in a game of chess, which of course he just absolutely can't believe. But it's just another setup to show us that Jenny is competent and intelligent. She was handled so much better than Alice was as a final girl. I mentioned she's my favorite final girl of the series, and a big part of that is the way that she's set up. And while all this is going on, we get a couple of POV shots from outside from Jason peering in the windows, watching everybody. We see Jeff and Sandra are dancing, and this is where Sandra starts to stir up a little bit of trouble because she starts telling Jeff that she wants to go see Camp Blood. She's just got to go see Camp Blood. Jenny wanders off to her cabin to go to bed, and we see a quick glimpse of Crazy Ralph's shadow up against her cabin. Somebody knocks at the door, but when she goes to answer, nobody's there. And she goes back inside, and Paul wraps his hand around her mouth, which I actually love, because it's another little glimpse into this relationship, but it also shows us that Paul's not just a nitwit. You know, he can actually keep up with Jenny and get the drop on her. They start some pretty heavy petting, and Jenny tries to tell Paul that she needs to tell him something, but he just shushes her up real quick, and they just continue on. And during this, we cut a couple of times to a pair of pants and boots walking around outside the cabin, and it turns out it's Crazy Ralph being a little bit of a pervert, kind of a voyeur. He's standing out there by a tree watching Paul and Jenny do what they're doing. Then a twig snaps, and suddenly barbed wire is wrapped around Ralph's neck around the tree. Well, more accurately, the barbed wire is dropped from above him, which means Jason had to already be on the other side of that tree and hovering about a foot over Ralph to pull this off. It's weird, but it doesn't bother me too much. I'm calling it out because that's what I do here. But as Ralph dies, we get another whiteout. I know they're just quick little transitions. I really don't understand why they bother me so much, but they really do. But Jenny wakes up in bed by herself, and we get the payoff to Paul's line about women's menstrual cycles, because in red lipstick on Jenny's mirror, he's written, "Beware of bears," which I am ashamed to admit I did not understand until way after I should have. I've been watching these movies since I was 5 or 6 years old, and that damn message on the mirror never clicked in my mind until I was probably in my 20s. But I digress. We're not here to talk about me. We cut to the counselors out on a jog, and Mark is talking shit to all the guys from his wheelchair about the girls showing him up, which I actually find pretty funny. Paul takes him on a quick nature hike, pointing out poison ivy and whatnot. Nothing really important happens, but we do keep seeing POV shots during this of Jason watching them from the woods. And Muffin, Terry's little Shih Tzu dog, wanders off into the woods and comes straight up to Jason's feet. Now I'm going to say something that may be a little controversial. Muffin comes back at the end of this movie, but I think that was a change and a reshoot that was done after this movie tested poorly with audiences. I think the feedback that they got was basically no matter what Jason did to any of the kids in this movie, he absolutely could not kill that dog. Now, my take on this is that Jason absolutely killed Muffin, beyond any shadow of a doubt. 100% that dog is dead. My take on this that might be controversial, I know there's some debate about it, is that not only did Jason kill Muffin, but Jason also ate Muffin. Now, before any of you animal lovers start wishing hateful shit on me, just hear me out, okay? It was set up less than 10 minutes ago that Jason's been living out in the woods on his own, eating animals, vegetation, whatever he could get his hands on to survive. Then we watch Muffin walk off through the woods and walk straight up to Jason's feet. It's a POV shot of Jason looking down at Muffin at his feet, and then we immediately cut to a shot of hot dogs cooking on the grill. The filmmakers are 100% telling us that Jason ate that dog, and you will never, ever convince me otherwise. It's what I call the read between the lines editing. Okay, great example. If two people start making out and that scene fades to black, we all know they're screwed. They're telling us that they slept together without explicitly showing it to us. And this cut from Muffin to the hot dogs on the grill is the exact same thing. But during their little cookout, we see Jenny cutting up some wood with a chainsaw, and then we follow her over to a cabin to stick it in a closet, which is yet another case of, hey, everybody pay attention, this is going to come up later. And while all the kids head down to the lake to have a good time, Sandra grabs Jeff by the hand and drags him over to check out Camp Blood. As they're wandering around, we see Jason stalking them, keeping an eye on them, but he's keeping his distance. Sometimes we see his legs or his boots, or sometimes it's just a POV shot. But during all this, they come across the brutally mutilated corpse of a little dog who just happens to look a hell of a lot like Muffin. Again, some people will say Muffin survived because she shows up at the end of the movie, but it's established later on that all that is a dream sequence like with Alice on the lake at the end of the original. But somebody grabs Jeff's shoulder and we get that musical sting, the jump scare sting. It's actually a decent little jump scare because we know Jason is there and we know he's been up their ass the entire time, but it's actually just Officer Winslow, who I'm pretty sure is only named in the credits. But he takes him back to Paul at the camp and warns him to kind of keep the kids away from there because it's condemned, and says if it happens again, he's going to run in whoever they catch out there. But then the deputy threatens Paul to get a warrant against him because he's too close to Camp Crystal Lake. Things have been quiet for 5 years. They want to keep it that way. So as punishment to be a smartass, at least in front of the deputy, Paul lets it be known to Jenny that Jeff and Sandra will not be getting seconds on dessert that night. So Winslow storms out and we cut to him driving away, and somebody in flannel runs across the road in front of him toward Camp Crystal Lake. He gets out, he hollers at him, and a chase ensues. I mean, it's nothing special. It's got no stakes. We know that's Jason. Winslow's just shown us that he's a prick, so we really don't care about him and are probably actively rooting for Jason to catch him and get murdered, which he does. He comes across this ramshackle, like barely put together shack out in the middle of the woods. It looks kind of like a broken down old single wide trailer that's like held together with random bits of wood and metal sheets and tarps, and it's actually creepy as shit. I really like the look of it. He goes inside, and of course it's about as nasty as you would imagine. It's falling apart. There's busted up furniture, a rotting toilet, and just some random bullshit thrown all over God's creation. But then he opens the door at the far end and sees something that completely grosses him out. But we don't get to see what it is yet because Jason sneaks up behind him and plants the claw of a hammer right into the back of his head. Again, that's nothing special, but it does show us that what Paul was saying was accurate. This is clearly where Jason lives, and it also sets up that there's something seriously fucked up in that room, but we don't get to see what it is yet. We cut back to the camp with Paul, giving another little speech about, today was easy, tomorrow the real work begins, and he gives all the kids a chance for one last night out on the town, except for Jeff and Sandra, who get voluntold to stay behind and watch the camp. And this is where most of the counselors leave, except for, I'll call them our core six: Mark, Vicky, Jeff, Sandra, Terry, and Scott. Everybody else just fucks off into town to go drinking. As they head into town, Terry immediately announces that she's going for a walk by herself in the woods in the middle of the night. And as the ones staying behind pile into the cabin, we see Jason's shadow as he walks across the path. And finally, at about the 45-minute mark, this is where we start to get into the meat of the movie, so to speak. Although I do have to say, I didn't feel this time passing as much as I did in the original. Just in general, I'm having a much better time with the cast. We get our obligatory tit shot with Terry skinny dipping in the lake, and somebody's watching her from the shoreline. And while that's happening, Mark and Jeff are arm wrestling until Sandra lures Jeff off to the bedroom. So Vicky offers to take Mark on in one of the handheld video games with some of the most awkward flirting I've ever seen. I'm not even going to spoil that. You have to hear it for yourself. But we cut back to Terry in the lake, and somebody takes her clothes. I think maybe they're trying to make us think it's Jason, because right after we see her clothes taken, we cut to another VOP shot with the playing over it. And that's something that they played with in the original movie, where if that sound was playing during a POV shot, it's because we were looking from the view of the killer. If it wasn't Mrs. Voorhees, then that sound didn't play, and they'll do the same trick in this one. But very quickly, Scott reveals himself and tosses her pants, but keeps her shirt and takes off, running up the path, where he immediately gets strung up by a Looney Tunes style rope on the ground that he steps into and gets whipped into the air and is now hanging upside down. And while Terry goes off to find something to cut him down with, Jason shows up and opens Scott's neck with the machete. And this is where I really noticed that we are missing Tom Savini. When Ralph got the barbed wire around the neck earlier, it was just some red around his neck underneath the barbed wire. And when Scott gets his throat slit, it's just a quick line of red across his throat. It's not even as good as the scene in the original where Annie got her throat slit, where it kind of actually opened up and then started bleeding. But of course, a part of that can be blamed on the MPAA, which was notoriously brutal on slasher movies back in the day. But either way, what we see of the effects are just not up to par with what they did in the original. Terry goes back to cut Scott down and turns him around to see his throat slit. She starts to scream and run away, only to stop and just scream into the camera. And then we cut away to a guy pretending to play a guitar in a bar. And this is where the counselors are hanging out. Ted is just blitzed out of his mind and hitting on the bartender. And this is where Jenny gives her theory, basically, on Jason and expounds on what it would be like for him as a special kid watching his mother get beheaded and what that might have done to him. It's actually kind of compelling, and it's a solid setup for a decision later that could have been a complete disaster and just what the fuck moment without, this little monologue. We cut back to the kids that are left behind at camp. Sandra takes Jeff upstairs and we focus on Mark and Vicky. And this is where we find out Mark is in a wheelchair because he was in an accident. And it's the classic, the doctors don't think he'll ever walk again, but he thinks that they're wrong. And Vicky finally just comes out and asks him if everything works except for his legs. And he says, I do okay, one way or another, which to me says that he has become a master at whispering to the empty cave, or finding the man in the canoe. He's a cunning linguist is what I'm getting at here. But when Vicky lights up a joint and offers him some, he turns it down because he's in training, which is the second time he's said that. And I do like this little moment because she finally just deadpan looks at him and says, for what? And he's got no answer. But they finally kiss, and Vicky goes off to get a few things before they're going to go off and find their own cabin for the night. And this is, I know it's another small moment, but this is something I've never understood. It's a little thing, but it's so weird to me. Vicky is wearing just like this plain pink-colored bra. And she pulls out this pair of shiny brown panties with a shit-eating grin on her face like it's the sexiest piece of clothing she could ever pull out. But when she drops her pants, she's already wearing a pair of black panties. Now, I'm just a regular guy. If a woman's willing to take them off in front of me, I don't give two shits what color the underwear is. And God knows I'm not a master of color coordination, but I've always been told that black goes with anything. And as far as panties go, black is, I'm pretty sure, universally the sexiest color. So why would she trade those out for some baby shit brown underoos before she goes to get it on with this guy? It's just something I cannot make heads or tails of. But we cut back over to Mark, and we quickly build up to what is easily the best shot of the whole movie. The storm's rolling in, it's starting to rain, and there's thunder and a little lightning, and Mark wheels out on the porch and calls for Vicky. If you were seeing this movie for the first time, especially back in 81, you might think that Mark was going to survive. I mean, the guy's in a wheelchair, and you just don't make people with that kind of handicap victims. Plus, I mean, they've shown us that he's physically strong. He's a pretty competent dude. But if you've seen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you may have figured he would end up getting the Franklin treatment, which really isn't fair because Mark is nowhere near as annoying as Franklin was. Dear God. But we'll talk about that another day. In any case, we get the POV scene of Jason coming up behind Mark, and then we cut to the front where a machete just smacks Mark straight in the face and buries into the flesh. He lets out this, guttural groan that's genuinely good, and the wheelchair rolls back along the porch and down the ramp and down the stairs when we get this awesome shot of that wheelchair going down the stair backwards with the machete hanging out of Mark's face and the lightning flashes, and then they've got to fuck it up with that weird whiteout thing again to cut back to Jeff and Sandra finishing up. But if you could cut just to that frame, the one frame before that whiteout starts, easily the best shot in the entire movie. It's absolutely awesome. After Jeff and Sandra finish up, we see Jason walk into the cabin and grab the spear that was set up earlier. He stalks up the stairs and into the bedroom, and in a scene that is directly lifted from Bay of Blood, he walks in and stabs the spear through both of them. And this is the scene that was butchered the most by the MPAA. Several seconds of footage were cut out, but they were added in later on the Blu-ray. You can also find it on YouTube if you've never seen it. You need to go check it out. It's pretty fucking awesome. We cut back to the bar where Paul and Jenny are heading back to camp, and Paul tells Teddy to head back once this place closes. Instead, Teddy turns around and ironically makes the best decision he will ever make in his entire life when he asks some random old dude if there's an after-hours place. The decision to stay out and get even more hammered directly saved this idiot's life. So even with the lame jokes and the annoying personality, Teddy might go down as the smartest dude in the history of slasher films, or for damn sure the luckiest. We cut back to Vicky going into the cabin looking for Mark, and she wanders upstairs and into the bedroom where there are clearly two people in the bed covered up with a sheet. But as she gets closer, Jason pops up in the bed, and she screams and stumbles back, and we see Jeff strung up and hung against the wall like he's hanging from a coat hook or something. Jason slowly raises a knife, and he inches toward Vicky, and the whole time she just stands there screaming with her hands up before getting stabbed in the gut. It made me think of Marcy in the original, where she just kind of stood there and took an axe to the face. Paul and Jenny get back to the camp, and of course they don't see anybody because everybody there is dead. Jenny immediately thinks something's wrong and heads upstairs and finds the bed soaked in blood. Then the lights cut out and they head back downstairs, and I really, really like this scene. It's another one. I don't want to oversell it, but I do want to sell it, because as Paul is over in the corner fiddling with the fuse box, Jenny's looking around and keeps saying, "Paul, somebody's in this room." And the camera is panning around the room. It is very dark. But then you do see Jason holding the spear just before he lunges at Paul. And the two of them start fighting, and Jenny just kind of stands there in shock until everything goes quiet, and then Jason pops up right in front of her face. And at this point, I'll go ahead and talk about Jason's look in this movie, but I really don't think there's much to say. The first movie famously ripped off Halloween, and this one is lifting directly from The Town That Dreaded Sundown. If you don't know, it was a weird, like, half slasher, half documentary that came out in 1976, and it caused quite a stir with the locals, but enjoyed some moderate success. Maybe more than moderate. I mean, hell, this thing still gets screened annually in Texarkana. But yeah, I mean, that's about all there is to say. They took the look of that killer with the jeans and the backwoods look and the sack over the head. They cut the eye holes down from 2 to 1 and just rolled with it. It is kind of creepy, but it just doesn't carry the weight that the hockey mask does. Jenny runs off and locks herself in the bathroom and spots the window over the sink. And I think this is actually a great misdirect, because we linger for several moments while she's holding the door shut with one hand and reaching for the window with the other. And the whole time we're focused on the door and expecting Jason to come there and start rattling it or trying to bust through it. But instead, when she reaches over to open that window, Jason busts through it. And it's another small moment, but it's very well executed. It was very well done. Jenny runs off into the kitchen and grabs a knife, and she starts to try to go out of that window. But instead, when she hears the doorknob start to rattle, she goes over toward the door and kind of steels herself with the knife held in front of her. That is until Jason busts in with a pitchfork, and she shrieks and runs to the pantry for some reason, which is where Ralph's body is strung up. And then she gets outside and wisely goes straight to the car. And this is great because, of course, the car won't start. We've seen it having issues the entire movie. Jason shows up and quickly ducks down and disappears until he starts stabbing the pitchfork through the ragtop. Jenny kicks the door open on Jason and just kind of abandons ship and runs off to hide in a bush. And this is where Jenny becomes my favorite final girl, because she waits in that bush until she can hear Jason coming up the path, and then just busts out of it and kicks him square in the balls. It's absolutely epic. The final chase in the original movie was the highlight of it. It was easily the best sequence. And this one, I think, actually improves on it. It's full of little moments of Jenny kind of outsmarting Jason, making him miss and misleading him. And it's just a genuinely fun chase sequence with a good mix of Jenny trying to get away and fighting back when she has to. Eventually, we end up in another cabin and find out that Jenny is hiding under a bed while Jason stalks around looking for her. One thing that I can't stand here, she's underneath this bed. She sees a rat coming by and she suddenly pisses herself. Not just pisses herself, but the piss puddles and runs out from under the bed, and Jason sees this, and that's how he finds out where she is. First of all, you're dealing with all this murderous, maniacal horse shit, and a rat is what makes you lose bladder control? And number two, assuming a woman is wearing panties and blue jeans, or any person for that matter wearing underwear and blue jeans, is it even possible to produce enough piss for it to leak through and form a full puddle like that? I don't it's one of those things that bothers me. But in any case, Jenny thinks Jason has left, so she finally comes out from under the bed just to see him standing on a chair that promptly gives away and crumbles to shit when he tries to stab her. She rushes over to the closet and grabs the chainsaw that we set up earlier and actually hits him in the arm with it. Jason goes down, but instead of finishing the job, she drops the chainsaw and picks up a chair to bust over his back. And then, once again, instead of finishing the job, she runs away into the woods. I feel like I have talked up Jenny a lot in this movie, and I think it's deserved, but these are definitely not the best decisions that she could have made. The whole thing could have easily been ended right here. But soon she comes across Jason's shack in the woods. Of course, she doesn't know that, but we do. And when she runs in looking for help because there's a lamp on, we can see through the opening of another door behind her that Jason is coming out of the woods and running up toward the shack. It's actually a really effective shot. And when she spots him, she takes off to that room that Winslow opened, and this is where we finally see what's in there that grossed him out. There is a full-on altar to Pamela Voorhees in here, complete with her severed head, the sweater she was wearing when she got killed, and some of the bodies of the other counselors. And this is where Jenny cements her place in Final Girl history, because she throws on that nasty-ass, half-rotted sweater and does her hair up as close as she can to Mrs. Voorhees, grabs a machete, and then starts talking to Jason as his mother, which stops him dead in his tracks. No pun intended. We get some brief scenes here of Betsy Palmer back as Mrs. Voorhees, which is always fun. We're seeing things from Jason's point of view here, where he does believe that this is his mother talking to him. This is as close as we will ever get to seeing what's going on in Jason's mind, at least until Freddy vs. Jason, but I've got some issues with that, and we'll get to that in due time. But Jenny tells him to kneel down in front of her, which he actually does. And she slowly raises that machete. Everything is going great until she kind of turns a little bit, and Jason spots his mother's actual head behind her, and then the jig is up. He blocks the machete with the pickaxe, and he slices into Jenny's leg with it, and that effect is actually pretty good. And this is when Paul shows back up, and he and Jason start going at it again. It's actually a pretty decent fight. There's bits of the shack falling down on top of them, and they're shoving each other through shit. I mean, it's not pretty, but it's a fairly realistic, just knockdown drag out. And just as Jason gets on top of Paul and goes to stab him, Jenny gets that machete again and brings it down right into Jason's collarbone. And he leans back and kind of wobbles for a second and then just falls over. Paul tries to pull her out of there, but Jenny cannot help herself and pulls the sack off Jason's head. And at least at this point, we don't get to see what's under there, but they are both very grossed out by it. Paul carries Jenny back to the camp and sets her on the bed in a cabin. They're basically just trying to pull their shit together and get ready to go get help. But they hear a noise outside the door of the cabin. Paul hands Jenny the pitchfork, and she holds it out, getting ready, while Paul walks over to the door. All he's got is the broken handle of that pitchfork. And he yanks the door open, and Muffin is there, wagging her little tail. And, of course, there are sighs of relief, and Jenny reaches out to Muffin, but Jason bursts through the window behind her with these long, lanky patches of hair and his weird mountain man beard and drags her through the window. Or does he? We get another whiteout transition directly to Jenny being loaded into an ambulance and calling out for Paul. Where's Paul? What happened to Paul? We never see for sure what happened to Paul, but the general consensus is that Jason killed him because the filmmakers have confirmed that this ending sequence with Jason bursting through the window was a dream. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but in that sequence, we see that Jason still has the machete sticking out of his shoulder. And at the beginning of part 3, when they give us the replay of this ending, we get an extra scene of him pulling the machete out of his shoulder and crawling away. Either way, we fade into a shot back at Jason's shack of Mrs. Voorhees' head on the altar, and the camera zooms in and just kind of stays on it, and the credits roll. And I'm telling you, this shot has to be a Mandela effect thing, because I swear to you, on vital parts of my anatomy, I remember those eyes opening and that head smiling at the camera before the credits roll. But they don't. It's just a shot of the head. Apparently they did film that, but it looked like shit, so the footage was never shown anywhere. At least that's the official story nowadays, but damn it, when I was a kid, I remember this. I know what I saw because I was sitting there when I saw it. But there you have it. That is Friday the 13th Part 2. Overall, I think it's a strong sequel and an improvement on the original in most aspects, with the exception of the ending. You just can't recreate the absolute magic of that iconic moment when Jason pops out of the lake in the original. They try, and they're going to try again, but they definitely drop the ball. Obviously, this one doesn't have the misdirects that the original does because it's not a whodunit. It's stated pretty early on that Jason is the killer, and when I sat down to watch it to review it this time, I wondered if I would miss those misdirects, like Steve and Mrs. Voorhees driving identical vehicles, but one's going toward the camp, one's away from the camp, things like that. But honestly, I really didn't. While this one does feel connected to the original, they do repeat some of the same beats. They're not just making the first movie over again. A lot of people say that, but I don't feel that. They expand on it. They do some of their own stuff. I feel like this movie stands on its own. I think you could come into this one having never seen the original and still have a good time with it. The gore effects and the kill scenes in general, with the exception of Mark going down the steps in the wheelchair, which is awesome, are a little lacking compared to the original, but I mean, they're not awful. They're still pretty fun. And Jenny's thesis, I'll call it, on Jason, on top of setting up the great mindfuck that she does to him at the end, actually adds a little bit of depth to him, so he's not just, generic serial killer X, which would have been a really easy thing to make him. This one is another solid recommend. It holds on to a lot of quality of the original, and the characters are more enjoyable, it's not quite so bland. If you enjoyed the first one, I think you'll definitely enjoy this one, and even if you didn't, I think you should give this one a shot. It changes the formula just a little bit, the pacing's a little better, the characters are a little better and more fun. Definitely check it out. I think it's worth your time. And of course, to wrap up with this one, there is another novelization to talk about. This one was also done by Simon Hawke. Both this one and his novelization of Part 3 came out in 1988. There's not much to say about the first chapter. It basically doubles down on the idea that Alice went back to Crystal Lake to try and confront what happened to her because it was causing nightmares and just generally a bad time in her life. Although I do want to point out that when Jason stabs her with the ice pick, we are right back to the searing white pain. Or, actually in this case it says searing while pain. Yeah, W-H-I-L-E. Again, should have spent some money on an editor. And again, every time somebody dies, the pain they experience is searing, hot, and white. But the next chapter picks up 5 years later with the introduction of Jeff and Sandra. And I just have to point out here that Simon Hawke also calls Sandra out as being 17 years old. which is a weird decision and a little problematic when you consider that means he will literally write a sex scene, albeit a very brief, but a sex scene nonetheless, for a minor later on. It's actually making me think of the Vampire Hunter D book series. I've only read the first 5, but it seems that the author is obsessed with 17-year-old girls. They're always a huge part of the story. He always describes them as unimaginably gorgeous, with special attention given to the curves and the contours of their bodies. I mean, I don't know if that's a culture thing or just the time that most of those were written. It never doesn't come off just really fucking creepy. But back to the book we're actually here to talk about. We find out that the house where Jeff and Sandra meet Ted is actually his parents' summer home, as if he needed one more trait to make him just a little bit more annoying. But his parents are actually in Europe for the summer and are trying to sell the house. Everything unfolds pretty much verbatim the way it is in the movie. One thing I do find interesting is when Ted and Jeff are dragging the tree out of the road, there's a POV shot of Jason watching. And in the book, in this moment, he refers to Jason as the Watcher. So, at least at this point, he's still setting it up as another whodunit, but that doesn't hang around very long. One weird little change is in the sequence where everybody's introduced and Paul starts giving them the let's keep our shit together speech. And that's when he goes over to help Jenny with the car. In the book, he actually does something with it. Like he takes out the air filter and he covers the carburetor intake. Basically, he knows what he's doing, which is a complete 180 from what we saw in the movie. It's just a little thing, but I don't really get the need to change that. As you would expect from a book instead of a movie, we do get some time in the characters' heads and get a little more in-depth with their thoughts and how they see things. But this time we get most of that with Jenny. Every scene that she's involved in, she takes over real quick as the POV character, which kind of makes sense seeing as she is the final girl. But the first one was much more, at least the book was much more of like an ensemble piece where the POV was constantly shifting between the different characters. The one focus or point of view that he does give us that I'm not too fond of is we actually get inside Jason's head and get a glimpse of his past. Simon Hawke writes that Jason was born at the stroke of midnight on a Friday the 13th, and that his labor was, quote, unnaturally short, as if the child within her were trying to claw its way out of her womb. And he goes on to make Jason out to be basically just generic evil child. He never speaks, some kind of evil presence, and, quote, cold venomous fury oozes from his eyes. Everybody always avoided him because of this evil aura that he put off. He made one of his school teachers quit, and a school psychiatrist wound up institutionalized after trying to help Jason. He does take the stance here that Jason has always been supernatural. He says that Jason has very vague memories of his drowning, but that he actually did drown, and at one point he just wakes up dragging himself out of the lake and vomiting up maggots and whatnot, and goes back to the camp, but it's already abandoned. Nobody's there. And he catches a glimpse of himself in the mirror. His flesh is decaying, but it's trying to heal itself, which is what leads him to run off to a shack in the woods and cut some holes into a sack to pull over his face so that he wouldn't have to see his reflection again. The one thing I do like, and that I think fits with the character of Jason that we've been presented in the movies, is he talks about how Jason didn't know where his mom was or why she wasn't coming to him, but that basically he stayed where he was. He was scared to death that if he left, he would miss her when she came to look for him, and that he would be in trouble. So I think that's an interesting little touch, something that could be played with. I actually enjoyed that. We're told that when Alice came back to Crystal Lake, Jason spotted her and was actually heading over to kill her, but she didn't notice him, but she got in her car and drove away before he could get close enough. So every night he started stalking the streets of Crystal Lake looking for her car, and eventually found it parked outside the apartment, where he sneaks in and kills her in the opening. And now there are more kids at the camp, and in Jason's mind, he has to kill them all because that's what his mother would have wanted. I just don't go with it. I just can't. You know, some people, if you're Jason drowned and he's always been a zombie, you know, that's probably your thing. It's just not mine. Another thing that did make me smile as far as characters go is when we get a few brief moments in Mark's head, because apparently he really is as dense as he comes across in the movie. The whole time, Vicky is on him like white on rice and a glass of milk and a paper plate in a snowstorm, and he sits there and wonders, am I actually imagining this? Is this really happening? I mean, the poor guy's already in a wheelchair, for God's sake. You don't have to make him a clueless dipshit on top of that. And speaking of Vicky, in the book, she does what she should have done in the movie and changes into a pair of silky black panties instead of the weird UPS colored ones that she puts on in the movie. Every time I see that scene, I think, what can Brown do for you? But another fun moment, really fun, I enjoyed it more than I probably should have, is later on in the bar. Remember when Ted was being all cute with the bartender and hitting on it a little bit, and it was very juvenile and like high schoolish? Well, it turns out that worked. The bartender's name is Maggie, and she was all about that shit. Basically, Teddy's approach was so different than the macho, trying to be cool horse shit that she got on a nightly basis that she was immediately into it, and she keeps wanting him to ask her what she's doing later, but he never does. So when Paul hands Maggie the truck keys because Teddy's plastered, Teddy asks her, not just some random old dude, if there are any after-hours places around, and she says, yeah, my place. Which just further cements Teddy as the smartest and luckiest character to ever exist in a slasher film. Not only did the comic relief survive by making the decision to stay out and get even more plastered, but he also got his wiener wet as a direct result of that. And I don't think there's another character in the entire genre who's ever had that happen. So a huge congratulations to Teddy. There is a brief little epilogue at the end with the sheriff. The big takeaway here is that they don't find any sign of Paul except for some of his blood on the floor of the cabin. But they do find Jason's footprints at the back of that cabin, at the window where he busted in to grab Jenny. So at least in the book version of this story, that part actually happened. But somewhere between there and the cops showing up, Jason disappeared. And the sheriff believes no matter how far and how long they canvass, they'll never catch a glimpse of him. Overall, I feel like this book is actually also an improvement on the original. Not as much as from movie to movie, but it's still pretty cheesy. It's definitely lacking in the editorial process. But pound for pound, I found it a more enjoyable read. I had a little bit better time with it. So if you could get your hands on it, you know, maybe in some kind of archive on the internet, definitely go ahead and give it a shot. All right, guys. Well, that is going to wrap it up for this episode of Matt and the Macabre. Be sure to join us next week when we look at Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D, the highest grossing sequel in the franchise. But was it better than the movie we just got? Listen in next time and we'll talk about it. Until then, you kids keep your noses clean, understand? We ain't going to stand for no weirdness out here.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Matt and the Macabre. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Join us next episode as we take a look at another piece of the wonderful world of horror. Matt and the Macabre is not affiliated with, and this podcast has not been prepared, approved, or licensed by any entity that created the media analyzed herein. Music is a horrid discovery by Ayla Scott, licensed under a Creative Commons license. If you enjoyed the show, support us by leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts, and join us over at patreon.com/mattandthemacabre for exclusive content. We'll see you next time.